There we go.
Got it. Yeah. Lovely.
I'm gonna resist the temptation to talk about saxophones and mouthpieces and
Oh, we can do that too if you like. I'm doing it often, of course.
Oh, I'm sure you are. Well, you're teaching, right, somewhere?
Yes, at the Royal Academy of Music. Yeah, I don't teach more than just a few times a term, but I normally go in and take a class. You know, kind of, we do a concert at the end, so maybe a class of 6 or 7 people. So you're essentially coaching the whole band.
Right, right.
But there are some saxophone players and occasionally others who just want to come along and, you know, have some improvisation classes or something.
Right.
Quite a few of us who sort of moving through. The students get a great choice, basically. It's probably...
Well, that's the school in London, right?
Yeah, there are about 4 of them, but for my money, the Royal Academy is the one that's attracts the most advanced. It's the most exclusive students there, you know. So
yeah, I had a student. He was a pianist who got a graduate degree there some years back. He was from Houston. His name was Steve Termini, or Steve Termini.
Oh, okay.
And he was very much into kind of the sort of fringier side of jazz.
Right.
But he was a great improviser and he was a great classical player as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether I met him.
And I was actually on that campus, but it was years ago.
Right.
My wife and I were visiting a friend in London, and you know, we were kind of making the rounds on our own. In fact, we went to the Pizza Express to hear Kenny Garrett one night.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And I remember that when the day we stopped by the school, they were on spring break, which was a drag because no one was really around.
Yeah.
But there were some students rehearsing. I think, was there a basement maybe somewhere?
Yeah, there's a lot of rooms in the basement. Yeah.
And they were burning. I mean, they sounded really good.
I know. I mean, to be honest, the main reason I go and teach there is because of that, because I get my ass kicked, you know, every time.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a good thing. That ass kicking is always a good thing.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's get into it. And
sure.
I kind of sent you some questions in advance, but they may turn out to be points of departure, and if that's cool with you, we'll go wherever you want to go.
Okay.
I'm very curious about your background in terms of education. Did you go to a place like the Royal Academy, or?
I did. So the one which is sort of equivalent to the Academy is called the Guildhall School of Music, and it's attached to the Barbican Centre in the City of London. So I was there kind of about 1985, 1986 for a few years, and I went there as a composer. And at that time I didn't really play the saxophone. I'd had one as a 13-year-old, and I got so interested in contemporary music and, you know, orchestration that I just kind of put the saxophone to one side. And so I had lessons. I was there for 4 years altogether, and for the first 2 of those I didn't play saxophone at all. So I was just writing, you know, contemporary music and studying scores. And I suddenly kind of had a bit of a revelation halfway through the course, where I realized that I was losing patience with having to write everything down, you know, and I wanted to get back into improvisation. I realized the missing link was the saxophone. So of my 3rd year, they were very kind. They allowed me to change my study to saxophone, and I blew my whole grant on buying a sax, and completely reversed. And basically I was told that unless I improved a lot during the first term, I'd be kicked out, you know, because I was very advanced in one way, but playing the saxophone, I hadn't done it for years.
But
as I just threw myself completely into it, because I realized that the improvising side was what was lacking, and everything was so predetermined, and hanging out with very, very intense composers all the time, talking about all of the different movements, throughout the 20th century, etc., and how hard it was and how geeky it was. So then I kind of realized after that it took about 2 decades from that point to try and marry together how my interest and love of jazz would match and sort of co-illuminate the worlds of classical music that I also loved.
Yes. Well, that explains a lot then, because I knew very, very little about you going into this. I knew about your playing, which was extremely impressive, just from the Chick Corea recordings. And as a saxophone player myself, I particularly loved your soprano playing, and your high chops, your altissimo is really first rate. But then I started scratching my head and wondering, well, how did you get such compositional background and particularly knowledge of writing for strings? There was a disconnect for me. Now there's no disconnect.
Yeah, sure. So I was writing before I was playing, essentially.
Yes, yeah.
I remember.
Well, who were your influences? Perhaps who did you like to listen to? Maybe on both sides, on the jazz side and on the classical side.
Sure. I remember listening in my teens a lot to Ravel and Debussy. And then from there went into, say, Takemitsu, Luciano Berio, and then Benjamin Britten, Michael Tippett. They're 2 very, prominent British composers,
right,
all of whom wrote significantly for strings.
Yes.
And there were some things which felt so home to me, that kind of very pastoral, quite romantic side of things. One thinks of, Samuel Barber and all of the way that that's been used subsequently in film music, for example.
Right.
And there was a Berio piece called "Points on the Curve to Find," which is a really unusual piece, which is kind of very fast, kind of hammered piano parts, and I think strings as well. And I was so influenced by that the very first album I made in 1988, which wasn't in any way attached to the world of Berio, I called "Points on the Curve." It's quite hard to find now. But that was an interesting starting point, because I chose to use a title for something where there really wasn't a relationship between the music. There wasn't. It was kind of like the music itself was influenced by kind of jazz fusion. I mean, that's, where the playing side started. So if you like, in a stepwise motion, a lot of the albums and projects I did were slowly trying to marry together in different ways what I felt to be what is the musical form which is the most fertile ground, which is like the ocean. It seems to contain everything, if you like, without it being oil and water, without trying to make a string section swing, like a sort of a Oliver Nelson number or something. So
well, I was just talking to Miho Hazama the other day about that very thing. The problem of don't even think about trying to get strings to swing, because it's probably not going to happen. There are ways that we can create an illusion, maybe that's happening. But not in the same way. So your listening interests in terms of jazz at that same sort of learning growth period for you was mostly fusion stuff or not?
I guess I listened to a lot of the things initially that my older brother was into. So that included things like the prog rock of Bill Bruford and that kind of thing, which obviously I joined Bill's band for 5 years at one point. and the funk things which were going on, like the Crusaders, etc., going back there, and Steps Ahead with Michael Brecker. I mean, listening to that album, Pools, you know, I remember listening to that when I was about 16.
Well, that drove us all crazy.
Yeah, you bet.
Smoking in the Pit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just finished, actually this morning, I just finished the biography by Bill Makowski, the new book about Michael. Right. I don't know whether you've read it yet, but it's
not yet, but it's on my list. I definitely, you know, was like, it was for him, for me, it was like listening to him. It was listening to other players like Keith Jarrett and Jan Garbarek, and the slightly, you know, European side of things, Kenny Wheeler, John Taylor, great piano player. These were people who I ended up playing with here.
Well, you just mentioned two of my favorites. I was a big Kenny Wheeler fan, still am, both as a writer and as a player.
Yeah,
and John Taylor, of course, and I also was a big fan of Jan Garbarek early on, particularly the things that he did with Jarrett, but then the things that he did on his own as well. Didn't he do something, I think, with Bobo Stenson? It seems to.
He started off with Bobo Stenson, I think, and then it was Jarrett that came along and kind of stole him. In fact, I think Jarrett may have stole the whole band and removed Bobo.
Okay.
It may have been that way around.
Oh, that probably helped Jarrett's or Garbarek's career quite a bit.
Oh, you bet, yeah. But I thought
in terms of international recognition, anyway.
Yeah, because they toured the States and as well as Europe and Japan. And in a way, Jarrett, I think, pushed Garbarek to be more extrovert, because the things that he did on his own became, to my ears, more introverted and maybe a little kind of sort of coffee table, you know, kind of ambiance.
Right.
To be cruel about it, but we all know that he's an amazing player, but he just chose to be more and more restrained. And I
really enjoy the things that he did with that choral group, the Hilliard, I think. Yeah, those are beautiful.
They really are amazing, aren't they? Yeah, his haunting sound, and I suppose you learn different things from different people. As a player, you might not think of, say, Joe Lovano and Jan Garbarek as particularly similar, but the thing which I found about the two of them is that they have a concentration on the meaning of a sound, you know, just playing one note. What is the kind of resonance, and it's a carrier wave for information and emotion, just one note. So in completely different ways. And I was really interested in the Paul Motion Trio all the way through the 1980s. And that also is another touchstone for me. In freedom, you know.
Interesting. So, well, I now understand your own music a lot better than I did 10 minutes ago.
Okay.
Yeah, because my next question was you've done quite a bit in terms of producing recordings with string ensembles. And sometimes you added a pianist or a bass player or even a drummer. And I was curious what possessed or inspired you to begin writing for this kind of unusual instrumentation in a style that you can't even put a handle on. I would be, and I don't think I did put a label on it. I may have used the word third stream, but I'm not even sure it's not even that.
That's got a slightly dated quality, but I think you mentioned contemporary third stream, and
that's exactly what I said.
So if that's not a genre yet, perhaps it should be.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of us out there, because jazz was always sort of rubbing shoulders with classical music and vice versa.
Oh yeah,
right from the very start. I mean, jazz in a way is already that hybrid.
Well, Paul Whiteman, you could go back into the 20s and Paul Whiteman.
Yeah.
He was trying to mash the two together in his own way. So you're absolutely right.
So there's hardly a time, yes, so that you can say that jazz is at its purest, because you'll always find someone arguing about what the definition of jazz is.
Oh, absolutely. I tried to define it, and it's extremely hard. You can't.
Yeah.
Because it's constantly changing, and it's constantly borrowing from other things.
Yeah.
I really think the marriage that you've achieved too is a uniquely European, and maybe that's totally a wrong outlet on or a conclusion on my part, but there's a different vibe about it that to me is a natural thing as an outcome of someone who studied in Europe, who grew up with European roots and ears on classical music, to reflect that sort of vibe that you are. I think the result makes sense.
Oh, that's nice to hear. I think that I've always wanted to make sure that if you're writing for fairly large forces, that they don't just end up as an expensive backdrop for the jazz soloists, you know. So the right way round, in a way, should be that the orchestra should welcome in the soloists into their world, rather than, you know, you just got a whole orchestra. But that's okay if you're writing like a song, so you've got, you know, Frank Sinatra, and then you've got an orchestra behind you.
Sure.
That's a done deal. But if you're trying to create something which is truly integral, then it's best to come from the orchestra first, and then make sure that the soloists have the ears to take as their starting point the true language, you know, of the orchestra and the genre, so they don't end up just playing, you know, bebop over.
Well, it's the difference between the Sauter Getz focus and Clifford Brown with strings.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Yeah. And I think people are finally, I think the composer players in particular have finally gotten that. We're reaching a point where these marriages are becoming more sensible, more logic, that they're working better. Had I been starting to work on the book for instance, today or yesterday instead of 2 years ago when I actually started, I probably would have maybe considered, for example, Helen Sung, the pianist, has a new record out with the Harlem String Quartet.
Oh yeah.
And she's done a terrific job at putting that both sides together, but coming from where the string players live.
Yeah.
And then figuring out where do we fit into the mix.
That's a great way around. Yeah. And I think I'm just going on to mention why strings in particular. When you've got strings, they do a number of significant things that the regular members of a jazz group can't do. So for one thing, you've got holding chords for an indefinite length of time. You've got certain types of voicings, which would be impossible for one person to play on the piano for sure.
Yeah.
And I think crucially, and this is something which is relevant to the Snows, it's possible to sustain essentially one chord, but then keep changing and morphing what goes on within it in a timbre wise.
Yes.
Indefinitely. So with the Snows, you've got a fair amount of pedal notes. You've got a very low C in there, but what's going on under over the top, you know, with shimmering sounds, it's rather like watching the play of light on a scene, you know, and every time the light changes, it's a kind of almost like a different scene, but yet, you know, there's a stasis there at the same time. I mean, that I think strings are so amazing at that. And that's one reason why it's good to use multi-divisi ideas, because then you get all the little artifacts happening within the stereo image, and it never becomes boring. You could just, you know, listen to one chord for ages, and it's never really just one chord. I mean, I go to one of my favorite composers, Henri Dutilleux, who's a French contemporary, excuse me, contemporary with Pierre Boulez. Both of them passed on now. It's if you're, I don't know whether you've heard of him, Henri in the Normal Way. And Dutille, I remember it because it sounds like dirty looks if you just read it in English. Typical Brit. But Dutille is surely the way you pronounce it. But he's someone who's an absolute king of creating sounds which are essentially in a sense of stasis, where you're just exploring the insides of one harmonic, vertical structure, and just looking at how you can decorate it. It's very French because it's like their cuisine. It's incredibly nuanced.
Well, you mentioned in one of your emails you used a reference to photography and shifting the depth of field. Yeah, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're while you're remaining static in terms of a mode or a harmony, you're creating all this inner motion within that structure. Yeah, and that's exactly what's going on in the Snows for great periods before you'll give us some change that we weren't even expecting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's very much in two halves. I think that was one reason when I first looked at the scores, they were, it's like almost two separate pieces, and I kind of bolted them together.
Yes.
I knew what I was wanting to do with that very undulating piano idea, with the kind of odd bar of 5/4 in there. I knew that if you play the tune in a certain way, and you have to be quite careful actually where you place the tune, because there are certain clashes that you just want to avoid. So it took a little while to get that right. But then I knew it would also, just to repeat that cycle would be a great way of improvising, where it's not like a groove improvisation. You're essentially kind of playing over this carpet. And because it's an odd asymmetrical structure, most listeners will just hear it as kind of just like a landscape. They won't hear a big repetitive beat going on.
No, exactly.
So that took care of the first half of things. And the second half, I just wanted to explore, like most of the whole album, actually, a kind of a dedication to sort of being more modal. In some of the earlier things, they were much more knotty in their harmonies, and this is quite pastoral and maybe many people would say slightly easier to listen to because it's the fairly standard modes going on. Right. And in place of the interest in the harmonies, I've tried to concentrate on the interest in timbre shifting instead.
Well, this is what attracted me to the score. We were initially talking about doing that other score from the Refocus, your most recent CD, which is a great piece, but I kept leaning back towards the Snows because I was very interested in what you were doing modally to make the texture move along. And I also thought I heard a bunch of different bowing techniques, which to the readers I think are important to get a handle on, which is that other area of using strings in your orchestrations that you can't do with any other instrument family. The number of effects that are achievable. If I'm not mistaken, there was one piece earlier in our email discussions where we were talking about effects. Because again, in the book, I'm interested in presenting a wide range of different kinds of pieces. And that's the Snows fit in perfectly to that overall game plan. But when we were talking about an earlier piece, and I don't remember the title at this point, but you will, I'm sure, where you had the string players bounce pencils on their strings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what was that piece?
It's at Rugged Land. And that was
yes.
The first piece, yeah.
Yes.
So that was a good instance of, the unusual way that we recorded this. So we had a large body of strings in Studio 1. And then in Studio 3, a much smaller studio, I just had 7 players. And with those effects, you can create more detailed sort of chamber-like sounds. But if it's essentially the same piece, so you've got this small group like the Concerto Grossi and the Ripieno group, you've got this small shoehorned group in the middle, you can have those sounds, but yet they are still part of this, you know, they're kind of embraced by the larger group.
Sure.
Yeah, and you can do all kinds of things, you know, like sort of multi-glissandi, etc. But yeah, it's so homogenous when you have, because essentially it's just different versions of the same instrument. So you've got this mass, you know.
Right. Yeah. Well, getting back to the Snows for a moment, at any point were you thinking about the original folk harmonies at all, or had you?
Oh yeah,
were you?
Yeah. So there's
it's only about a 3 or 4 chord piece, as I recall.
Oh yeah, I mean, you could do it in two harmonies, really.
It's all triadic, yes.
Yeah, there's a famous folk singer called Dick Gockham, and he was the one who first sang the tune that I know. Although since then, of course, I've heard many people sing it, and it's from the northeast of England, and I lived there for many years as well.
Oh,
it's essentially it's just Dorian, but then that sixth drops to the minor sixth and goes into Aeolian near the end.
Right.
From that's sort of quite unusual in a way, because even if you just hear it as a completely monophonic song with no accompaniment at all, you'll hear that drop as a big emotional shift, as the
very
major
much so. Yeah.
And so that was the first thing. Also, I loved the words, and it's really interesting how you've chosen to put them in, because they are amazing.
Well, I needed to do that because I think without the words, it doesn't make as much sense.
Sure. Yeah.
In fact, I remember there's a wonderful quote from a Dexter Gordon interview from many, many, many years ago, where Dexter is talking about learning how to play a ballad. He says you have to know the lyrics of the ballad if you're going to really get inside the tune and do justice to it.
Yeah.
So I thought, particularly since it's a public domain piece, I can go ahead and publish the lyrics and not worry about getting sued.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're way past that. Well, likewise, with that's another great reason why you can look at these tunes. They have the better ones have a kind of a primordial sort of, very they're very kind of DNA. They've got a power about them, normally because they're so simple. They're almost like the archetypes of many of the tunes, which have come since. And it's because of the pedal note that I put in there, then it becomes very easy to sort of shift and create 2 or 3 other harmonies. So I think I put a Phrygian in there at one point where the second drops, and that every time you shift, it creates another emotional sort of resonance. It's rather like a flash of color. And so you're able to, you could keep going. And in fact, you can imagine maybe another type of piece where, in a more sort of something that Jacob Collier would do, or probably has, where you just go crazy and every note has a different harmony. But of course, that is counterproductive in the extreme if you want to create something like a vista and revel in the glory of, having 53 string players all playing to you. And sometimes just writing good old C minor, or you listen to it back on your Sibelius, software, and you're thinking, so what? Then you listen to the same thing in Abbey Road, and all of a sudden the heavens open, and it's the most beautiful sound you've heard.
Well, yes, a case in point is I remember years ago when I was studying, and the sixth chord, the major sixth chord, had become very sort of passé. But because it was so associated with the much earlier years, the Tin Pan Alley years, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But honestly, the sixth chord has a great sound if you voice it right, and you use it in the right moment.
Yeah,
it still has a wonderful sound.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, and I know I asked you in an email about that, but I'm not sure we ended up with the right answer. And I want to make sure that the readers do know. At one point in the very introduction of the piece, you have 2-2-2-2-2 notation over the what was it, the harmonic tremolo or something that you had going?
That would be dividing. Hang on a minute, I can look.
So I guess the question was, when I saw that, and I came to the natural conclusion, oh, that's explaining the divisi. He wants 2 on this note, 2 on this note, 2 on this note. But when I did the math, it didn't jive with the actual number of strings that you told me you used in the session.
Oh, okay. So it may have been, of course, that when you have the Studio 1 session, but then of course you've got 7 more strings in Studio 3. So if you add all of those together, then it probably works out as okay. I think the other reason I put there, you can't always manage it, of course, because of the strength of the strings, but I was also trying to avoid just one person ending up, because sometimes it happens if it goes down the desks and there's someone sitting at the end and they're the only one. Now, then that allows the possibility of just a single player just occasionally to sort of jut out. And so if you want to make sure that it's truly kind of manifests as a bigger sound as possible, you want to try and avoid those solo sounds unless you're bringing someone forward, to play a melody or something. So that's the thing. I wanted to make sure everything was doubled.
Okay.
And similarly, if you ever see something like inner outer, that means that it's got to be divided down the middle of the desk. So the outer players play one part and their neighbor on the inside plays the other. So that ensures that you get a good split all the way up the stereo image. It's very filmic, but it works. It makes a real difference.
I wonder, I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so now I think we know. I'll need to go back and make sure I've clarified that right in the chapter, the distribution of things. I'm interested and the readers are always really interested to learn, excuse me, because I found that this was true in volume 1. When we did interviews, we always talked in general, not so much about that piece, but in general, when you're doing a writing for that kind of record, let's say. What's your compositional process? How do you work? Or does it vary?
Well, it does vary, but often at the piano, I would say. Quite often, if there's a melody which is already there, or even just a fragment of melody, it won't be a case of just harmonizing it. There'll normally be the case of searching for interesting counterpoint. And I think if there is an aim to write for larger forces, then you need to get into counterpoint straight away. Because anyone can just, plonk down a vertical harmony underneath. But it's essentially the tune should coexist with at least one counter melody or, fragments of other linear motion, so the inner parts, and this would be the same with, say, a jazz quintet, where you're just trying to make sure that people have interesting lines which add forward motion. Try and concentrate on, the horizontal, the sort of streaky bacon idea of lots of simultaneous lines, and then what I call thumb fun. So you're sitting there, and it's what the inner harmonies are doing with your hands at the piano, and you're just messing with the inner parts of the chords to create variations in the harmonies, of course, but even more important, some sort of exciting melodic fragments. If you listen to, Bartok, of course, it's just amazing to listen to the kind of counterpoint he was creating. But I go back to Dutilio and listen to him. And you can hear it, of course, in so much jazz, so much great jazz. There's elements of that. But I would say that in many cases, the jazz composers would be tipping their hat to what they've heard in the classical world, maybe up to 100 years earlier, and they've just assimilated it.
I'm so glad you mentioned, you sort of underscored counterpoint and the importance of counterpoint, because it's often I think can be an overlooked step when younger writers are beginning, because this is so easy, the vertical part, it's easy to understand, but to get a linear flow in the music is something that is often overlooked, I think. At some stage. It was funny because just yesterday I was arranging through email another interview next week with Jeff Beal, and he was reading through his chapter, and Jeff and I made a point of saying that he is really brilliant, I think, as a contrapuntal writer. That's one of his real strengths.
Yeah.
And while unfortunately there wasn't that much in the piece I ended up selecting, which is actually a very old piece now, but he made a comment in his return email. I'm so glad, by the way, that you mentioned my counterpoint, because I think that this is a real strength and often is overlooked in jazz charts.
Yeah. But it gives a sense of forward motion. It gives a sense of momentum.
Oh, absolutely.
And it can be, of course, also a spur for improvisers. I mean, one of the things I've always loved is the ability through composition to bring out new elements in the improviser. So we did quite a lot with years ago with a trio of mine called Storm's Nocturnes with Jeffrey Keyser and Joe Locke. And Jeffrey, because his left hand is so amazing, he was able to, we didn't need a bass it was so rhythmical, we did 3 albums with that band. And we used to call it the jet lag trio, because no matter where we met, at least one of us was jet lagged. It's a crazy idea to do that. So there was London, San Diego and New York, so it's wherever you went. But we kept it going for as long as we could. But they used to complain, obviously, because I would write stuff and they would have to get it under their fingers and it sounded quite classical. But I think they too appreciated the fact that when you get into composition at just a slightly deeper level, some of the kind of muscle memory that you rely on as an improviser, it just doesn't work anymore. So then it just pushes you, and hopefully a deeper form of expression. That's what you're looking for, and as a result. So it is difficult to, as a player, as an improviser, to force yourself out of those familiar grooves, those familiar ruts, the muscle memory, the oral muscle memory. And the only way to do that is to play with different people who are playing a different kind of music. Yeah.
Where what you're playing, what you're used to and comfortable playing, kind of like the old shoes, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't work, and it.
Yeah.
And move you out of that comfort zone.
Yeah, the creative urge, is forever in that way. It's just that it never tallies with the sort of commercial idea of having to fit everything into a box. Yes. I mean, the albums, it's quite hard to tour a large group, of course, and in order to get something staged with an orchestra, you've normally got to go through a senior conductor and programming, and people will always say, well, who is this written for? All of those questions, which are kind of valid, but when I was writing this, and probably like everything I've written, I'm not really thinking of exactly who I'm writing it for. I just I feel driven by it. It's almost like you can't not write it. It's what you're hearing,
Right. Well, I'm really impressed with the new Refocus CD and the sort of influence coming from the original Getz, which in fact is the very first chapter of the new book, is Pan from That's where we start.
You've got a lot of string effects in that saltando, spiccato effects and
Yes.
Sometimes you can't hear in that recording, you can't hear the depth of detail because of the quality of the recording at the time.
Absolutely.
And also you do get the feeling that they may have had a limited amount of time to rehearse and record it. It actually sounds quite scrappy.
Well, everything that I've read about that proves that your comment is right on the money.
Right.
Yeah, that was very, I won't say haphazardly, but it was very under rehearsed and could have used more time, without a doubt. I actually have a copy of from the Yale School of Music archives of the original I'm Late score.
Oh, wow.
And it's pretty fascinating to look at and try to decipher what's going on.
Yeah, I've seen some of it. So his hand, it's typical of professional arrangers of the time, who of course didn't have the cut and paste computers. Right. So you would have all kinds of tram lines to say, well, this is the same as the last bar, and this is the same as that. And so it kind of looks like a scrappy shorthand, doesn't it? You can't conduct from it. Really?
Oh, no.
But people had to try, I mean,
they did what they could do,
Yeah. And there's something great about using your hand as well, rather than just going straight onto software.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. It's a good segue into asking about the kinds of, in your creative composing process, what kind of tools do you take advantage of? Do you use a sequencer? Do you still like to use one of these pencils and a piece of paper?
Oh yeah, you bet. Like, so for example, I'm always surrounded by these kind of, full of ideas.
Good for you. Yep.
Many of them not usable. I don't know. Many of them almost unreadable. But I've got countless and smaller books, that are great for taking on flights and things. But it's the larger the ensemble, the more handy having the software is, especially as you're, I love Sibelius software. I remember when it was kind of version 1 or version 2 or whatever, when I first.
Me too.
Yeah,
because I converted from Finale.
Okay,
I had started with Finale and I hated it.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, it's gotten a lot more user friendly, but still, I'm a converted Sibelius user from the get go. It's just so much more, I think, user friendly.
Yeah. And I mean, hitting playback just to make sure that you haven't made any silly mistakes, and all of the transposition of the instrument, all of these things, it's made everything so much easier. I mean, for years, I just used to put every stave to a piano sound. So it just sounded like there was a whole school of pianos, because I could hear rhythmically what was going on. And it also forced me to use my imagination.
Sure.
Whilst I was studying, obviously, I just sat at the piano, and if you were writing something for a string quartet, you had to imagine the strings, and you need to exercise that in the same way that you would go to the gym. Exercise your ability to imagine instruments and not rely on those samples. And I think especially for this kind of hybrid music, so with Refocus in particular. We had Asaf playing a very, very light drum kit, because the natural dynamics, one thing, and the tenor as well, it could so easily just drown out the nuances of what you're writing for the strings. And that kind of thing is very hard to replicate on a Sibelius. You really need to just know how everything's going to sound.
Yeah. You have to have that sort of oral palate memory up here.
I've been doing it for long enough now. I mean, the first time I to do this hybrid stuff, well, I was still at the Guildhall School of Music, and for my last year, one of my entries was I took the tenor solo from Blue in Green, the Coltrane solo, and reharmonized it and wrote it for a chamber orchestra. and that was one of the first things I did. So I was probably about 23. So
Yeah.
I was already interested in that. And then I had a string quartet join one of the tracks on Storm's Nocturnes. That was about 2001, maybe 99 or something. But there was never really a question that wasn't going to be one of the main interests, to see how many different ways are there of looking into 21st century music with this maturation of styles, where it's not a novelty anymore. We're in a post-iPod age where the whole orchestra are listening to all kinds of things, and their sense of time and rhythm is so much more sophisticated. These young orchestras now are kind of used to using a click, and they're used to understanding how to deal with syncopation. And I mean, that in turn led me on to writing some music for film and TV, which is, you know, help paying the bills. But yes. I used to say to myself, every time I'm doing something, even if it seems like quite a bread and butter idea, I'm bound to learn something, you know, totally crucial. It might be to do with divisi, or it might be to do with the natural volumes, or the tuning of double bass harmonics. You know, that's a feature, because they're not going to be in tune with the rest of the guys, you know, or microphone placement, even something like that. So as long as you feel as if you're forwarding your main love, yes, then doing this, you know, the more commercial side is a great way. I'm sure Eddie Sauter would agree with me.
Oh yes.
You know, so you can pay your bills, keep the lights on, and further the cause of what, you know, the work with a capital W, you know.
Yeah, no, exactly. Now, I noticed that almost without exception, all 10 writers that are the focus of this book, nobody put bowing markings in, down bow, up bow. Absolutely no one. Yeah. And that has so much to do with how things are going to sound. But I'm assuming that, like me, I'm not a string player, that better left to the player to deal with. Would you agree?
It's a sign that you trust your players, yes, and that you have a good working relationship, whoever the leader is just sitting down there on your left, that you can quickly, you know, because they'll shout things across to each other, and sort of 10 seconds later, it's all scribbled in. Yeah. I mean, the only time I tend to put bowings is if I want a significant amount of consecutive down bows. So then you just want to make sure, you know, or consecutive up bows.
Up bows, right.
So and that might only take a bar or two, and then you just write sim or something, and then done. But the amount of time saved, bearing in mind there's never really a time with a large ensemble where time isn't restricted. Everything is to do with efficiency and how quick you can get, you know. So then if you can then give over some of the work to the players at the time, you know, absolutely, and they're always right. You know, they know how it's meant to sound. You know, they know how to make themselves sound as best as good as they can as an ensemble. So yeah, and it makes the score look a lot simpler as well. I mean, I do put slur marks in and things like that.
Yeah, well, those are more like phrase indications, and that makes sense, because you don't need to be a string player to know how you want that to be phrased.
No, it's also the case with harmonics, that I tend just to write the circle, whether it be a natural harmonic or a stopped harmonic. You know, it's like because sometimes they'll say, "Oh, have you thought about doing a, you know, this is actually a natural harmonic or on a lower string, or shall we, in fact, we can create a flortando harmonic sound, but it's not actually a harmonic. Check this out." And then they feel, "Oh, that sounds great," you know, write that down. So
do that.
I mean, a lot of the time I'm working with players who I know at least a little bit, and they have got to know the kind of things I like. So maybe if there was to be some sort of commercial publishing of scores, I'd probably go through them again and just mark them up a little more. But, you know, as a case in point with the Snows, actually, I mean, you could see the first ones I sent you, which were 2 individual scores, all kinds of holes in there, which, and I had an idea at the time of, I could probably loop one section, which I kind of ended up doing. So I took it out on its own and put a couple of bars silence or something like that. And then I knew I could kind of fit it in. So the sort of post production side is part of the composition.
Yes.
I think these days more than ever, because I'm conducting, obviously, I'm always putting the saxophone on afterwards, but that also gives me a chance to play over it and see, well, is that really what I want? Maybe I could add an escape bar and let things breathe or something like that. And you think, that's perfect. Thank goodness I don't have to get all the players back just to do it again. I can surgically do things on Pro Tools. And then, yes, it's a good idea then to have a look at the score afterwards and have a before and after comparison, see what actually you did.
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, I forced you to do that because.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did. I mean, it wasn't just me actually as a player that was just kind of working off. I don't think I worked off a score actually. I think I just played because I knew the music so well by that time. I just kind of played. But with Jason Rebello, who kind of features in the second half where he starts to solo, I gave him a part, and we were just kind of trying a few things out, and he really got into some stuff, and it seemed to fit so beautifully with the orchestration. The things which he would play exactly in a gap where I had played, and just, that sounds wonderful. And then he got about 2 beats out at one point, and he got so fed up he just did one of those great long glissandi all the way down the piano. And I thought, you know what, I'll shift that back. So if you listen now, I shift him so he's back in time, but I kept the glissandi in. He was just trying to indicate to me to stop recording, but the glissandi actually ended up in there.
The miracles of modern science, right?
Well, yeah, it's also that when you're shot through with that jazz sensibility, you're always looking for ideas on the fly. The score is a joy, but even more of a joy is when it lifts itself from the page and just becomes real and spontaneous.
I'm happy to hear you say that, because that's my philosophy. Even if I'm working with a big band, it has a score and everything is dictated. I was always changing things around. Let's cut this from here to there, and then let's do this. The notes were only there as kind of a guide. I mean, I never destroyed the piece, but I was always looking for ways to sort of make the score ours rather than just someone else's.
I think that's another important point about going back to what is your process as a writer, because the kind of things which struck me as I was growing up, that kind of rather, I suppose there is an English sense, or certainly a sort of a British sense of string writing going back and listening to the albums that my father had. There was a lot of French stuff in there as well. Granados and going down into Spain. But to me, it felt very European. And one of the first bands I ran for years was called Lammas, which was a mixture of kind of Celtic folk and jazz. Oh, okay. And I felt that was more me than, just getting a swing band together. Obviously, I was totally in love with some of the players, the earlier players, all American, of course. But I wanted to make sure that something chimed with who I felt I was. So it was really me, and I didn't feel as if I was wearing a hat, at that time.
Absolutely.
And that stuck with me quite a lot, because that folk band, that was when I heard a lot of these tunes for the first time. So The Snows is probably a melody that I have known for 30 years, and it's there in some form, because one of the questions you asked was, you hear the tune at the beginning, then it seems to kind of disappear, and you fly. If you take the album as a whole, there are shades of the tune which come in more than half, so.
Yeah, no. In fact, I heard you quote it in a
Okay.
couple of other solos, I think, that you
Right.
play on other pieces on that same album.
There's one tune where I thought I'd just write another reharmonized version, like a ballad, where I'm playing and it's just slow strings. And I can't remember what I called it. Hang on a minute, I've got the album here. It might be High Fell. But it's essentially, what I did at the end was just mute the saxophone and realize that what I had there was a really nice atmospheric solo string piece. So you can sing along with the tune, with an invisible tune, which is there as a sort of a presiding spirit, but it's not actually there physically. You can't hear it. So in a way, I was making sure that I did vary enough from the melody. So when Jason comes in for the second half of The Snows, then we're off. And it's the pedal note idea that starts to really take off. And then the harmony start to move.
Starts to grow from that, yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, this never forget just how rhythmically lucid and rhythmically vivid the strings can be without the need of a rhythm section. And I think maybe that's one thing, because one of your questions was, what would I advise people to think about? If you're writing for strings, never forget just how groovy they can be. We're not talking about jazz syncopation or swing feel here. We're just talking about just how much transience there is on the front of the notes. So, a good string section should really be able to bite and give you those sforsandos and,
Yes, exactly. Now, you provided a rhythm section in a way, a sense of momentum and groove through that entire, particularly beginning with the piano solo. From that whole second half, shall we say, of the piece. There's this energy, there's this groove that's always moving through the string section. You're passing it from one instrument to another. The rhythmic figures themselves are changing, but there's still this sense of there's a motor going through the whole piece. Even though perhaps the other part of the string section might be playing a sustained figure. So when you have that many strings, there are really some wonderful things that you can do that have nothing to do with traditional swing, in that traditional sense of the word. Yeah,
it's so like the bass pattern in 5, just that simple bump, bump.
Yes.
You know that as long as the guys playing the sort of clave pits, just those quarter notes in the middle, that any decent, self-respecting double bass player is going to be able to manage that just fine. I do normally try and see who's on double bass, because I know the guys who also play jazz. So I just sort of try and ask one of them to come in. But that we're spoiled. We've got so many wonderful string players here. And then, it's also just getting the Bartok snap, which is that when they're snapping against the fingerboard, all of those things, you can put them into, they become, like percussive elements, almost like there's a kit they're playing.
Sure.
And that was very exciting, because I realized halfway through Weather Walker that having drums was not something I needed this time to do. There was so much potential with a large string group,
Yes, I can believe it. Well, as we get into we've gone about an hour, I think.
Okay.
Why don't we summarize by me asking you, for all those people out there who want to write, who are jazzers, who want to begin to use strings perhaps more in their writing, what suggestions might you have? You made some throughout the course of the last hour. Are there any other things that you would like to leave us with, or even comment on The Snows that I forgot or you haven't said yet?
Oh, sure. Let's see. Well, I mean, inspiration can come from a lot of disparate places. So you might be listening to Johnny Mandel or Bob Brookmeyer, just the two people whose harmony is well worth, checking out. And it can be that you may be writing something, but what the inspiration behind it might have come from somewhere really quite a long way away. I mean, listening to some of the things, you know, kind of real jazz funk, sometimes you hear these things, which, you know, I wonder what that would translate if I tried this, you know. It's always a case of moving things across. I suppose try and avoid paying lip service to one of your influences. If you want to write something which really is honoring a style or a player, get into them deeply, and so there's no sense of lip service or sort of just that servicey thing. Sometimes you have to do that if it's a kind of a commercial assignment and whoever's hired you needs it by tomorrow morning. But if it's your own heart project, you know, look deeply into every influence you have, I suppose I would say. I mean, I would love I was talking to a friend of mine, Simon Lasky, who was, he's been to Banff a couple of times. And that's somewhere I would love to go to, because I just feel there's so many people who are seeing this as maybe one of the most fertile parts of music making for the 21st century. You know, now we're over a lot of the mutual prejudice, and there's so much life. So, you know, if you know anyone who can get me over there, I would love to go.
Oh, listen, I would love to see you come over here and meet you in person instead of this is better than nothing. But I was so pleased that I came across your work, and in some ways I think we can thank my publisher, Chuck Sher.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Chuck sent me he sent me something that was a beautiful ballad with strings. And it wasn't from Weather Walker, I don't believe. It was, I'm not sure what it was from.
There's, have you heard an album of mine called Songs to the North Sky?
Yeah, oh, I haven't. Yes.
Oh, okay. So it's, and there are a couple of ballads.
I think it's on that. And it's about something like about traveling, maybe.
Oh, yeah. So there's one called The Traveler's Horizon.
I think maybe that's it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, The Journeyman's Horizon. Yeah,
because I think I mentioned your name maybe when I encountered it listening to Chicks Things and so on that you were on. Yeah. And anyway, it came up, and I was so sorry at the time it wasn't on my radar, particularly as a saxophone player writer. But now you are.
Well, it's great to be part of this project. You know, I'm really looking forward to reading, you know, all of the other entries there in the book. So,
well, I hope you will, and of course we'll send you a copy of it.
Oh.